Chapter 8 covers political participation. Last week we talked about public opinion and how people think about politics. This chapter will cover how people actually act and carry out their thoughts about politics. So at the top of your guided note sheet, you can see your objectives for this unit or your learning targets. One will discuss how American voter turnout compares to other advanced industrialized democracies. Specifically, we'll look at European countries and how their voters act compared to ours. 2, describe the historical expansion of suffrage, or the right to vote in America, and how this has affected voter participation. And finally, we'll explain what factors determine who participates in politics. Now, you should have gone through and answered your guiding questions for Chapter 8, who governs and to what ends. Your questions for this chapter start with who votes and who doesn't. And so what sort of generalizations can we make about who actually shows up to the polls on Election Day? Now, overwhelmingly, the most indicating factors would be your age and your education. People who are older tend to vote more consistently, more often, and people who are younger tend to be less consistent in their political participation. Your other factor is education. People who have a college degree turn out at much higher volume for Election Day than those who have a high school diploma. 2, ask why some people participate in politics at a higher rate than others. And your book talked about a number of different possible answers for this question, but one of the big factors here is just going to be overall interest in politics. If people are interested in politics, they tend to be more efficacious, or to have this belief that their vote actually can make a difference. So interest is going to be huge in determining who is going to actually participate in politics. If you think about it, if you don't care that much about politics, you probably don't think it affects you that much, and that your vote really makes a huge difference. Therefore, you'd be less likely to turn out to vote. Your to what ends questions. One said, how did the framers of the Constitution think average citizens should participate in America's representative democracy? We talked about this a little bit with our Chapter 7 lecture and public opinion, but the framers of the Constitution generally didn't think that the American people should have a decisive role in our democracy. They thought the right to vote was important, absolutely, but if you think about the election systems that are set up in the Constitution, we really don't have a lot of popular elections. For example, until the 17th Amendment, senators are chosen by state legislatures rather than the average American citizen. The president still is not chosen through popular election. The only election that the framers set up in the Constitution that directly involves the citizens' vote is their member on the House of Representatives. And 2, this is totally an opinion question. You should have justified your answer, explained why or why not. Should today's college-age citizens participate more in politics? And that answer is going to vary. Now, as we look at a number of statistics on voter turnout rate, it's important to keep in mind these 2 figures. First, the voting age population. The voting age population, or the VAP, is going to be composed of all U.S. residents ages 18 or older. And so anyone that is 18 or older will be included in this number, whether or not that person is actually eligible to vote. So in 2012, the national voter turnout rate, according to the VAP, was 53.6% of Americans. Now, the reason we would use a VAP is because it's easier to calculate. It's easier to look at the census and just say, this is how many residents we have over 18. It's an easy figure to determine. Now, the VEP is going to give you a more accurate result of voter turnout. The voting eligible population is going to exclude U.S. residents that are not legally permitted to vote. So, two groups that are excluded from the voting eligible population are non-citizens, like resident aliens or illegal immigrants. So, people who are here on green cards are people that are here illegally. And then two most convicted felons are going to be left out of the VEP. So the national voter turnout rate in 2012 using the VEP was 58.2%, which is almost a 5% difference from the VAP. Another important thing to consider here is that for a long time the VAP and the VEP in American history were very similar. Most people over the age of 18 were able to vote. However, as time has gone on, we have seen more populations that are not eligible to vote that are otherwise included in the VAP. We have more resident aliens, we have more illegal immigrants, and more felons in the United States. And so those two lines on our graphs are kind of going to start to diverge. You can see the numbers today are about 235 million Americans that are included in the VAP, and 215 million Americans included in the VEP. The reason most felons are excluded from the VEP is because they don't have voting rights in most of our states. 48 states in the United States bar felons from voting while they're in prison. Your exception are Maine and Vermont. And Maine and Vermont allow felons to vote from prison. Now, in 2012, 5.85 million Americans were barred from voting. Now, the question here is this disproportionate punishment? Based on our prison populations, we have an overwhelming majority of the prison population that is Hispanic, Latino, and African American. Now, this is an issue that varies state to state. Each state gets to decide how they're going to run elections, and with that they get to decide if felons get to participate and to what extent. So North Dakota bars felons while they're in prison, but once an inmate completes their sentence and any parole or probation, they can vote again. So once they're out of jail and they've completed their parole, we give them their voting rights back. Now in Florida, if you commit a felony, you are unable to vote pretty much for the rest of your life unless you choose to go through a clemency board to get your right to vote back. So in Florida, 1.5 million residents, many whom are previous felons, are unable to vote. And they can't vote unless they go through that process. And that can kind of be a hurdle for people who have these charges against them. Another hurdle to voting is voter registration. So in most states you have to register before you can actually vote in an election. The only exception is North Dakota. Now, North Dakota used to have an affidavit system. So you could show up to the polls, you should have brought your ID with, but if you didn't have it, essentially your neighbor could legally sign off and vouch for you that you live in the district and that you're an eligible voter. Since 2012, North Dakota has tried to institute a number of voter ID laws, and in recent years, some of those have lasted, some of them have been overturned by judges. For example, in 2012, North Dakota passed a voter ID bill that required certain paperwork from tribal populations, elderly populations or nursing home residents, and college students. This was in effect for the 2014 midterm election, and many of those populations saw issues with the new requirements. For example, at UND, over 300 students were turned away from the polls because of improper ID. What ended up happening with the 2013 voter ID bill is that it went to the courts, and the courts decided that bill was unconstitutional. that requirement basically picked on certain populations. And if North Dakota was going to institute a voter ID bill, it needed to be sort of a blanket bill that covered everyone and required the same thing out of everyone. Now, currently, we have a new voter ID law, and it doesn't include that affidavit option or that ability to basically vouch for your neighbor. But instead, it allows voters without an ID to cast their ballot, and that ballot will be set aside until they can produce an ID. Now, an ID that's out of date, or the address is out of date, so on and so forth, can be supplemented with a current utility bill or a bank statement. Valid forms of ID under the new law are issued either by the Department of Transportation, so like your driver's license that you pick up at the DMV, or by a tribal government. It also includes options for those in special circumstances, such as those living in a long-term care facility. Many of them who don't have a driver's license anymore or any sort of government-issued ID. Again, the question of disproportionate punishment comes up in regards to voter ID. If we take a look at this graph, you can see that all citizens, 11% of that population does not have a government-issued photo ID. However, if we look at some of those populations that we discussed earlier, we have low-income voters, young voters, and African American voters who have much higher percentages of their populations without voter ID. For example, 25% of African American voters do not have a government-issued photo ID. Methods of voter registration vary from state to state. So this pie chart looks at how people registered in 2012. In 2012, about 1/4 of the population registered with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when they went to get their driver's license, they also registered to vote. That's going to be the result of the motor voter law, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Now, the most common way to register to vote would be to get a form, either downloaded from the internet or picked up at your local county government office. And you're going to fill out that form or that application process and mail it back either to the government office or an election office. That's going to be the most common way to register to vote in most states. However, more and more states are starting to allow same-day voter registration. So you can see in 2012, 6.3% of the population registered at the polls on election day. Many states are going to same-day registration because people see voter registration as a barrier to voting if it has to be done within a certain number of days before election day. So to get the most people out to vote and the most people eligible to vote, many states are moving in that direction. Who registers to vote? This is going to vary by age, but overall, about 2/3 of the American eligible voting population register to vote. Of those 2/3 that register to vote, only 2/3 actually show up to vote. So that's where we get about that 50 to 60% of the American population voting on election day. Now, registered voters vary by age. Again, older populations are going to register to vote more than younger populations. Like I said, about 1/2 of non-voters are registered. And people who don't register to vote claim that it is a burden, that it's a burden to register to vote, that you have to basically take time out of an already busy life to go through this application process, and that's not even on election day. So the burden on registration can impact who actually decides to register to vote. Now, Get Out the Vote drives are going to be used to encourage voter registration, and then they're going to be used again right before election day to actually get people to the polls. However, what we'd found with get out the vote drives is that they're really only impactful during elections that we already expect low turnout. So get out the vote drives are pretty much ineffective in presidential election years. Presidential election years, we're going to get the most turnout to vote. However, if we look at midterm elections, which happen in between presidential election years, or if we look at primary elections, which happen in June before the regular election, those we expect lower voter turnout. So get out the vote drives are actually going to be more effective during those types of elections than they will be during presidential election years. For example, Fargo School Board needed to pass a referendum just a couple years ago, and pretty often not many people take time out of their day to just go vote on a school board referendum when there's not any other major offices on the ballot. So what happened a couple years ago with Fargo Public Schools is they put their referendum to a vote and hardly anyone turned out. Less than the number of people employed by the district turned out to vote in the referendum vote that year. That year the referendum failed, and so Fargo suffered for money a little bit, and then the next year they tried again, and this last summer is when the vote took place. So this last summer they decided to basically do a get out the vote campaign to spread news about what the referendum was, what sort of things it would cover, and then they actually went door to door and asked people, how are you going to get out on election day to vote for this school board referendum? And at this election this summer, we have a much, much higher voter turnout rate, and the school board referendum passes. So get out the vote drives really only work in low expected elections. Then we have the Motor Voter Law, and the Motor Voter Law is signed in 1993. And what it did was it required that people would be able to register to vote when they got or they renewed their driver's license. Now, if you look at the graph here, I'm wondering how significant this law has been on registration numbers. So you have a green line in 1993 when the Motor Voter Law is passed. And what we kind of see for most age populations is that the voting rate continues to fall. Now you can see this vote is based on voting age population, so the VAP. It could have possibly been more accurate if they had used the VEP, but just for the sake of it, we could generally make the assumption that voter rates have continued to fall even after the Motor Voter Law was passed. Now, the reason we think this is because the Motor Voter Law made it very easy for people to register. It was not something that they had to go out of their way to do. And when you're automatically registered to vote, it's not this sort of burdensome process that we talked about a couple slides ago. And so it might not be as important to you to turn out on election day. If you're taking time out of your day to actually register to vote, you're more likely to show up on election day. The Motor Voter Law made it a little bit too easy, is kind of the general consensus there. Now, there's 3 reasons that people identify as reasons not to vote. And so registered voters gave 3 major reasons why they chose not to vote, even though they had registered. And number 1 was they were too busy or they had scheduling conflicts. Now, this is the argument that gets brought up when we look at making Election Day a federal holiday. Would that make it easier for people to get to the polls and kind of eliminate that scheduling conflicts piece? Now, Election Day is on a Tuesday in November. So I would argue maybe it would make it easier. But on the other hand, you could also have people that take Mondays off, make it a long weekend, a 4-day weekend, and so that sort of issue has also been talked about in regards to making Election Day a national holiday. Now, the second piece that voters identified was they had family chores or they had other obligations. Kind of the same argument as I was too busy or I had scheduling conflicts along those same lines. And finally, they said they believed their vote would not make a difference. Why would I vote? It's not going to have an impact on the outcome of this election. So what these voters lacked was efficacy, that belief that your vote can actually make a difference. You can actually have an influence on the government, and your actions can have an effect. People with strong feelings of efficacy tend to vote way more often than those that are not efficacious. So, you have a box on your sheet there. I want you to brainstorm for a minute. It just says to describe the most efficacious person in the United States of America. Now, what I mean by this is what are some generalizations we can make about who has a high sense of efficacy and who doesn't? What are some of those characteristics? What we've generally found is that women tend to have a higher sense of efficacy than men. People who are 60 years or older tend to be more efficacious. Those with a college degree, and those who are wealthy. Those tend to be among our most efficacious people in the United States. You have a couple questions for you on your note guides. One says, are Americans satisfied with their system of government? And then is low voter turnout good or bad? And why? Why do you think it's good or bad? Now, when we look at voter turnout rates, there's a couple things we can think about here. One, are Americans satisfied with their system of government? We could look at voter turnout rates and say, less people are showing up to vote, they must be satisfied. If they really wanted something changed, they would make time to come to the polls. On the other hand, you could look at those same statistics and say, people are not satisfied with their government. People don't believe that they can actually make a difference, and at this point, have they just given up hope? And so they choose not to participate. Now, is low voter turnout rate good or bad? And you could interpret this a number of different ways. You can think about the education piece. We talk a lot about how the founders thought the average American citizen is not going to be super informed on the issues. And that's what they thought 200 years ago. I would argue that's still the case today. Many Americans show up to the polls and aren't super informed on the issues. And even if you think you are informed, even if you've done your research on the presidential candidates and your Senate races and House races, you're going to show up to the polls to vote for those races. And there's going to be like 10 other county races, city races, probably a whole lot of names that you really haven't heard before. And so you can talk about education in terms of low voter turnout. Is that a good or bad thing? Is voting the most important form of political participation? Or is there something that we would prefer our citizens to be more active in? And who really cares about voting? Maybe we want our citizens engaged in other forms of civic duty, like participating in organizations, participating in religious organizations and political parties at the local level, so on and so forth. Now, early on in the semester, we talked about who was all eligible to vote at the time the Constitution was ratified. And we said that only about 10 to 15% of the population was eligible to vote at that time. And these were white males who owned property. Now, after the Civil War amendments are passed, people are granted the right to vote regardless of their race. So in the South, this becomes a major problem because Southern landowners do not want their previous slave populations voting. And so Southern states institute a number of sort of barriers to voting for these populations. So it starts with the literacy tests, and most African Americans and poor populations in general were not literate or able to read and write. So the literacy test was used by many state governments in the South to prevent those populations from voting, to prevent African Americans and poor white men from voting. Years later, the poll tax was used in Southern states, and the poll tax is going to disenfranchise the same population. Essentially, it is a tax that's collected at the polling places, and you need to pay that tax to be able to vote. So poor populations, again, are not going to be able to afford that privilege. Now, in the late 1800s, the Southern states passed what they call the Grandfather Clause. And the Grandfather Clause allowed potential white voters to circumvent literacy tests, poll taxes, and other tactics that had been designed to disenfranchise Southern African Americans. Years later, we have the white primary. And so people could run for elected office regardless of their racial background. But in the South, we have primary elections where only white voters could participate. And so as a result, African Americans who wanted to run for political office never really had that opportunity because only white populations were allowed to participate in the primaries. It's not until about 1964 that the federal government decides to take action on a number of these issues or barriers to voting that are taking place in the South. They do so first with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and a year later they pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You can see in 1964 we have no African American legislatures in the South. However, after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are passed in 1964 and 1965, the number of African American legislatures in the South continues to grow year after year. The Voting Rights Act is going to target specific states and populations more than others. So looking at the map, you can see the different areas of the country that were targeted by the Voting Rights Act. So it's mostly your southern states, and then Alaska, Texas, parts of Florida, so on and so forth. So in 2013, we have a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder. And you can see Shelby County is located in central Alabama. And in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court ruled that the formula that was used to define which areas fell under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. And Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required some places, mostly in the South, to obtain federal permission before they could change their voting laws. So this was still in effect many, many years after the Voting Rights Act is passed. Now, Shelby County argued that this was an antiquated law, that this was addressing an issue or attempting to address an issue that was no longer present in current day political climate in the South. Now, African American and poor populations were kept from the polls via a number of different tactics, whether that be the literacy tests or the poll tax, so on and so forth. Those populations were allowed to vote by law, but states had instituted a number of programs that basically kept them from being able to vote. It was a different story for women. So in the early 1900s, women still, by law, are not able to vote. And so they start this fight for women's suffrage, for women's right to vote. And the campaign to win the vote for women nationwide succeeded with the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Now, prior to 1920, many states had started to allow women to vote, but nationwide they weren't able to until the passage of the 19th Amendment. Once the 19th Amendment is passed, women start to turn out to vote in very similar rates as men. So they immediately start to participate in politics in that way. Now, we talked a little bit about VAP versus VEP at the beginning of the lecture. I want to talk about the myth of the vanishing voter. I talked about those two populations kind of diverging, and you can see that to begin in this graph around 1976. So actually, as far as voter turnout goes, the proportion of voters that have participated in elections have stayed relatively similar since about 1928. However, people often talk about how we've had the lowest voting turnout rate in recent years, and so on and so forth. And we have seen lower percentages of the population, the VAP, participating. And you can see that by the blue line on the slide here. However, if you look at the red line, the VEP, those that are actually eligible to vote, in 1948 were around 52% of the population, and in the 2012 election we're at nearly 60%. So the idea that we have a vanishing voting population could actually just be due to a skew in statistics based on voting age population versus voting eligible population, and that sort of diverging statistic in society today. Now this graph shows voter participation in presidential election years, and you can note that prior to the early 1800s, tons of people participate in presidential elections. Near 80% of people are participating in presidential elections. However, prior to 1980, where we see that sort of peak in the graph, voting fraud was very common. Political parties, not the government, printed ballots, and they were often cast in public voting booths. So there was no checking who was eligible to vote and who was not. Essentially, up until 1980, the rules were very easily evaded until we take on the Australian ballot. So in 1980, we accept the Australian ballot as our form of voting. And the Australian ballot is the ballot that you see today. It's a government printed ballot of uniform dimension cast in private voting booths. It's heavily regulated, and political parties don't have the ability to influence the ballot anymore. You can see then that after 1890, our voter participation rate dips tremendously, but it stayed relatively consistent since the adoption of the Australian ballot. Now, how do people participate in politics? So about 22% of our population are almost completely inactive in politics. They don't vote, they don't get involved in political organizations. These people commonly have lower incomes, they're young, and they have little education. Then we have voting specialists. And voting specialists are those people who vote but otherwise don't participate. So they come out to the polls on election day, but otherwise they're pretty removed from political participation. Commonly, these people are older and again have less education. Now, campaigners are not only going to vote, but they're also going to get involved in campaign activities. So you can see this guy, he's a campaigner. He's going door to door to represent a campaign and talk to potential voters. Campaigners are commonly better educated than the common voter. They have an interest in politics and identify with a political party. and they're often known to take strong positions on political topics. Now, communalists are very similar to campaigners in their social background, but they don't like the conflict of politics and the conflict of campaigning. So communalists, they're going to vote and they're going to be involved in their community, but they're more so going to be involved in activities of nonpartisan nature, of less polarizing nature. Parochial participants do not vote or campaign, but they are willing to contact local officials about local problems. So if they're having an issue, they might reach out to their representative, but they're not going to show up on election day. Finally, activists tend to participate in all forms of politics. They make up about 11% of the American population, so they might be involved in campaigns, they're going to go out to vote, they're going to be those people that are commonly getting in touch with their representatives, they might be involved in other public organizations, whether that be religious organizations, charitable organizations, so on and so forth. And activists are commonly highly educated, and they have high incomes and tend to be middle-aged. Now turn to page 182 in your textbook, and there's a few paragraphs there on participation and its causes and its meaning. Why do we have 22% of the American public that chooses to not participate in politics at all? And then we have people that participate in literally all forms of political life. So page 182 in your book is going to attempt to make some generalizations about the causes for people participating and the meaning of participating. Now, there are many factors having nothing to do with apathy that shape our participation rates. So age, race, party organization, the barriers to registration, popular views about the significance of elections, efficacy, all of those sort of issues are going to help shape participation rates. So because of that, we really cannot make broad generalizations about the causes or the meaning of political participation. Now, general trends show that fewer Americans may be voting, and we talked a little bit about the discrepancy with that, but more and more Americans are participating in politics. So they might not actually make it to the polls on the election day, but they might be spending every Wednesday night at church. They might be going to charitable organization meetings. They might be involved in community affairs, and so on and so forth. So while fewer Americans may be voting, more Americans are participating in our political system. Now this graph looks at people who have turned out to vote based on demographic characteristics in the last 4 elections. So 2012 is the most recent data we have, back to 2000. So it says describe the eligible voter that's most likely to turn out to vote based on the table above. So for schooling, you can take a look at those statistics. For people who have 8 years or less, they don't complete high school, they don't get a high school diploma. For those that do complete high school, and then for those that complete a bachelor's or advanced higher education degree, you can see overwhelmingly people with a degree tend to show up to vote at much higher rates than those with a high school diploma or less. So I would say the eligible voter that's most likely to turn out is going to have some sort of higher education degree. Now, if we look at employment, you can see the numbers there for those that are employed and those that are unemployed. And the numbers for employed people are much higher, again, than those that are unemployed. So the eligible voter that's most likely to turn out is going to have a higher ed degree and be employed. Now, if we look at race, white and African American voters tend to turn out at about the same rate. In 2012, they were right around 62-63%. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week, how African Americans and white populations do show up to vote at the same rate, unless you add socioeconomic conditions. So, if someone is poor and they are white, they are more likely to vote than someone who is poor and is African American. But if we take away those socioeconomic circumstances and just consider race or ethnicity, our turnout rates are about the same. So the eligible voter that's most likely to turn out based on those rates is going to be someone with a higher ed degree who's employed and is white or African American. You can see Hispanics show up at a much, much lower rate than the other two populations. Now you guys can take a minute to watch the video here on the Occupy Wall Street movement. Once you've done that, I want you to take a closer look at the questions for this video. So 1, did the lack of a unified message impede the goals of the Occupy Wall Street movement? Did a lack of a unified message have an effect on their outcome? So on and so forth. 2, was Occupy Wall Street a successful movement? And in what ways? And then finally, what demographic qualities, if any, did these protesters share? Did they have a similar background? Were they kind of a melting pot? So on and so forth. Now, that is all of my notes for Chapter 8. If you have any questions regarding any of the units in this chapter, Chapter 4, 7, and 8, reach out to me via Schoology or email. Try and get back to you before your test tomorrow. I have added to the updates page on Schoology some questions that are similar to those that will be on your test. So those numbers on that post correspond to the numbers that you find in the study guides at the link on the AP Gov homepage on Schoology. See you guys tomorrow.